welcome everyone to PAC, the Palestinian American Community Center's webinar. This is our second webinar about Palestine, and we're very, very excited to have Abby Smardon joining us today. So the topic today, we're going to talk about Let's Talk Unruh. So I'm going to introduce Abby, and then we'll get into the topic. So I've met Abby several times. She's absolutely wonderful, a very, very nice, passionate, awesome, hardworking individual you can clearly see it through all the amazing work that she does. So since the end of 2010, Abby Smardon has served as UNRWA USA's Executive Director, where she oversees projects to raise critical funds and awareness in the United States for UNRWA's work, where she oversees projects to raise critical funds and awareness in the United States for UNRWA's work. I just repeated that. She travels extensively throughout the region to facilitate and evaluate humanitarian projects to benefit refugees. And I think that's a very humble bio for all the amazing work that Abby does. So today we're going to be talking about the work UNRWA does, Trump's recent funding decision, UNRWA's current funding crisis, and what we can do to help. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Abby. And again, like we said, there's going to be about a half-hour presentation, and then we're going to be opening up the floor to questions and answers. So please, Abby.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rania, for that really lovely introduction. I'm really happy to have the chance to speak with you all today, particularly right now with the really unprecedented challenges that UNRWA, the agency, is facing, and the unprecedented challenges that Palestinian refugees across the Middle East are facing. So I'm really happy to be able to tell you more about the work, how you can get involved with what we're doing, and really give you a chance to ask me questions that might be of interest to your community. So I'm going to go ahead and pop down to slide 3. What is UNRWA? So many of you might already very, very familiar with the work of UNRWA, but in case you're not, UNRWA stands for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. Quite a mouthful, to say the least. But basically what the agency does is it provides humanitarian assistance in the form of education, healthcare, social services, and emergency protection to over 5 million Palestinian refugees across the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. It's been carrying out this work since 1950. It was originally meant to be a temporary agency until a just and durable solution for the plight of the Palestinian people was achieved. As you know, it's now been 70 years and we're still waiting on that just and durable solution. So in the meantime, UNRWA has really become a human development agency for these refugees in the absence of a solution. And as I mentioned, the agency works in 5 different fields, and each field has its own very unique challenges for Palestinian refugees. So in Lebanon, for example, Palestinian refugees do not have any form of citizenship, which creates huge, huge burdens for their lives. In Syria, obviously, we're contending with a gruesome war where Palestinians are some of the most vulnerable communities living there. In Jordan, many Palestinians, the majority of Palestinians, do have a form of citizenship, but not all do. And there are some really great challenges that those communities are facing. Obviously, in the West Bank, Palestinian refugees there and all Palestinians are facing the challenges of the occupation and the human rights violations that go hand in hand with the occupation. And then in Gaza, as I'm sure you all are very aware, it's now 11 years into a land, air, and sea blockade, which has effectively stopped any sort of movement in or out of Gaza. And on top of that, the people of Gaza are facing recurring military assaults, and including what we're seeing right now with the violence that's happening along the border in Gaza. So it's very, very challenging work that the agency undertakes because of the grave and unique challenges that are different in each field. But as I mentioned, at its heart, UNRWA really is a human development agency. It runs the highest achieving public school system across the Middle East, with 700 schools educating over 500,000 kids each year. It employs a staff of 33,000 people. 98% of those 33,000 are Palestinian refugees themselves. So that means the agency's doctors and teachers and engineers and social workers, by and large, are refugees. So in many ways, one of the greatest contributions that UNRWA is able to make is providing meaningful employment and economic opportunities to refugees, Palestinian refugees specifically, living in the Middle East. Just popping down to slide 4, I've already mentioned this, but it really is an agency of refugees helping refugees. In Gaza, for example, it is the largest public sector employer, employing about 13,000 refugees in Gaza alone. If we move on to slide 5, just something that I think is really important for people to understand. I've kind of given you an outline of what UNRWA is, but understanding what UNRWA USA is also incredibly important. So we are a national committee that is committed to serving as goodwill ambassadors for the work that UNRWA does. We raise funds and we raise awareness among the US community in support of UNRWA's work. And it's truly our duty to make the US community aware that Palestine is truly a human rights issue. It's a social justice issue. And it's important that we're partnering with causes where we share commonalities and can amplify each other's voices here in the United States. So now what is happening with the decisions of the current US administration, UNRWA USA's work is more important than it has ever been. And having the support of the US community is more important than it's ever been. So if we move on to the next slide, basically what I'm alluding to, which I'm sure many, if not all of you, are already very much aware of, but in January, the US administration made the unprecedented decision to cut funding to UNRWA from $360 million down to $60 million. And I think it's really important to note that since UNRWA began its operations in 1950, every single US administration from President Truman onwards, no matter what political affiliation the president had, has stood with and provided strong and generous committed support to UNRWA. So this is the first time ever that a US administration has cut funding to the agency, and it has been cut significantly. I cannot overstate, from $360 million down to $60 million is a catastrophic cut in funding for the agency. So with this decision, UNRWA's critical services are truly at risk, at real threat of having to be cut. And so the agency is making a large-scale appeal, letting the global world know that it's going to take all of us standing together to ensure that the agency can continue serving Palestinian refugees amidst this very, very dramatic funding crisis. So when the decision was made, our Commissioner General, his name is Pierre Krahenbuhl, UNRWA's Commissioner General, he said something that I thought was very poignant, and it's something that we like to share as much as possible with our supporters. And he said, we should all draw our strength from Palestine refugees who teach us every day that giving up is not an option, and UNRWA will not give up either. And I think that's really the sentiment that the agency is feeling and working with right now. UNRWA is doing all that it can to ensure that no program has to be cut, that no refugee misses out on a service that every person across the world deserves, and that no employment is cut because of this very, like I said, unprecedented move to cut funding. If we move to the next slide, this is actually a photograph of Pierre Krahenbuhl, UNRWA's Commissioner General, when he was speaking in Gaza directly after the decision had been made to freeze funding to UNRWA. He has continued to appeal very passionately to the global community to help make up this deficit, And in March, there was actually a pledging conference in Rome where there were many countries that have stepped up and are giving additional contributions than they normally would. But even so, the current deficit that UNRWA is looking at for the year is $200 million, which is still an unprecedented deficit for the agency. And so when we think about this deficit, we have to really think about what is at stake here, what is at risk. And with that, let's move on to the next slide. What's at risk here, first and foremost, is the education of over 500,000 children across the Middle East. If this $200 million is not made up, there is very, very real uncertainty if when UNRWA schools close for the end of the school year, does that just mean they're closing for the summer, or is this a permanent closure because the agency doesn't have additional funds to reopen in September? And that's a real question that the agency is asking, and it's asking of the global community. Is this something that you would want for any child, let alone 500,000 children across the Middle East? So, just to take a step back and really try to illustrate how important this is, speaking specifically about education, schools are UNRWA's biggest program, with over 50% of UNRWA's budget going towards the school system. UNRWA runs 700 schools across the Middle East. As I mentioned, it's the largest public school system and highest achieving public school system in the Middle East. It's a school system that achieved gender parity in the 1960s. So, girls have made up 50% of the classroom since the 60s, which is unheard of for many school systems across the world. As I said, UNRWA students consistently outperform their peers in school exams. There are millions of highly successful UNRWA graduates who have made and are continuing to make incredible contributions globally. I'm sure there are many that are a part of PAC who are contributing greatly to the community in New Jersey. I know there are thousands across the US doing that. And so with the threat of UNRWA schools closing, this is really threatening the future of millions of children. And beyond that, it's really threatening the future of regional stability, because if children don't have an option to go to school, what do they have? So this is, these are the real questions that UNRWA is asking the global community right now. Is this what we want for our children and for their future? If we move on to the next slide, it's not just education that's at risk, it's many of UNRWA's programs. One of those is also UNRWA's Emergency Food Assistance Program. Again, with this $200 million deficit, UNRWA is talking realistically that food assistance could run out as early as this Ramadan if the agency cannot fill the gap that's left by the US decision to cut funding. So that means within the month. I mean, that is how imminent we're looking at these threats to programs being cut. And if I can just speak a little specifically about how critical food assistance is in Gaza, I think it's really, really important to note that the need for food assistance is directly tied to the blockade on Gaza. Due to the blockade, unemployment continues to grow at unprecedented levels across the Gaza Strip, particularly among young people. This blockade has left 80% of people across Gaza, and there's 2 million people living in Gaza. 80% now rely on some form of humanitarian assistance, and most of that humanitarian assistance is coming from UNRWA. To give you an idea about the need for food assistance specifically, in the year 2000, only 80,000 people across Gaza required any sort of food assistance from UNRWA. Currently today, 1 million people require food assistance. And so you can see what the blockade has done to de-develop the economy in Gaza, and how it has basically forced people who were never reliant on humanitarian assistance to have a real need for support. And again, the majority of that support is coming from UNRWA. Now with this deficit, again, that means this assistance, specifically food assistance, is at real threat of being cut. Let's move on to health. Next slide. I want to talk specifically about healthcare in Gaza, how the electricity crisis, which I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are very much aware of, but there is an electricity crisis in Gaza that has been going on for over 1 year now. The majority of people who live in Gaza are getting anywhere between 2 to 4 hours of electricity per day, and there's never any certainty of when they will get that electricity. So it really does turn people's lives, their daily lives, upside down, because their daily life revolves around if and when they might get electricity to carry out whatever activities they need to do that would require electricity. So when I actually visited Gaza in August, what struck me most about this electricity crisis is how much UNRWA health services are being affected by it. To give you an idea, currently UNRWA health clinics are now using generators as their primary source of power, which is certainly quite dangerous, and it's certainly quite costly as well. Because medical equipment runs on a different current than the clinic's backup generator, machines like x-ray machines, ultrasound machines, lab testing machines, none of them can run on full capacity because they're running on a different current. I mean, these are things we wouldn't necessarily think of, but they really are incapacitating a lot of the services that need to be carried out for people's health to be properly taken care of. The World Health Organization has continuously warned for the past year that at least 30 hospitals and at least 70 primary healthcare clinics and even blood banks in Gaza are at severe risk of full or partial closure due to this continued electricity crisis, and there not being enough fuel or spare parts for backup generators. So this is very much already a health catastrophe in the making. When I was there in August, I heard from UNRWA nurses and doctors who said they're seeing cases coming into the health clinics that they've never really seen before, skin rashes from heat and bacterial infections, potentially from direct exposure to sewage, which, as you might know, the water situation in Gaza is nearly as catastrophic as the electricity situation, in that 94% of water is not suitable for individuals to drink. And because of the electricity crisis, raw sewage now is basically being pumped into the sea rather than being pumped through a sanitation plant as it should be. This means that people in Gaza are directly exposed to raw sewage, and this, with the electricity crisis, is compounding a lot of health issues that people are facing. We're seeing a lot more cases of psychosomatic illnesses and psychological stress directly tied to these crises that particularly hit children. And I'll talk a little bit more about the mental health situation in Gaza a little bit further down. But something else that I would just want to mention, because again, I don't think, we here in the US always are able to kind of conceive these sort of things, but because we do have access to electricity at all times. But when I was visiting the UNRWA Health Clinic last year, I spoke with several UNRWA doctors and nurses who spoke very, directly about how they are personally affected by the electricity crisis. When I was there, it was the heat of the summer, and doctors and nurses were telling me, they're only getting 2 or 3 hours of sleep because the heat is so bad and they can't have a fan going because the electricity doesn't work. Or others were telling me that, they get up in the middle of the night if they have electricity because that's the only time that they can really take care of their sort of domestic chores that they need to take care of, because they don't know when they'll otherwise have electricity. And so they themselves, these doctors and nurses who are refugees themselves, are really facing, the terrible challenges of the electricity crisis like everyone else. But then they're still coming into work, day in and day out, and serving their community to the best of their ability. Truly refugees helping refugees. But it causes a lot of stress, and it's certainly not something that's sustainable, to say the least. And I would just add that health concerns in Gaza are really only getting worse. If you've been following the news, since March 30th, Palestinian refugees in Gaza have been gathering along the Israeli border to highlight their dispossession in 1948. The 70th anniversary is actually coming up quite soon. And they're protesting the growing humanitarian catastrophe, which we're talking about right now. Now, unfortunately, these protests have been met by live ammunition used by Israeli security forces at protesters, killing and injuring hundreds. This has left hospitals and medical staff in Gaza really struggling to cope, especially amidst this fuel crisis that I'm talking about, and the dwindling medical supplies, which are directly related to this 11-year-long crippling blockade that the people of Gaza are facing. So UNRWA, of course, is the place that most refugees in Gaza turn to for mental health support, for physical health support. But the capacity of the agency is stretched so thin, given these rapidly increasing crises. And now with this funding crisis that's just compounding, these health services are also at real risk of being cut. And truly that would be catastrophic for the people of Gaza, to say the least. If we move on to the next slide, speaking a little bit more about the impact on mental health. So since the start of the protests, which I've just mentioned, over 500 children have actually been injured. 4 children have tragically been killed, and 3 of those children were UNRWA students. So, this gives you a sense of the trauma, of, just the catastrophic conditions that young people, everyone in Gaza, but particularly young people in Gaza are facing. And a lot of that trauma is not new. I mean, it's trauma that young people have been facing for years. Obviously, the assault on Gaza in 2014 played an incredibly tragic impact on children there, as well as adults, of course. And those scars are still lingering. That assault actually took a very heavy toll on Gaza's children. More than 500 children were killed, and over 3,000 were injured. And so, those are very, lasting scars, both physically, but also psychologically. Children over the age of 10 in Gaza have now lived through 3 rounds of devastating violence. And there's really, a lot of anecdotal evidence that shows that, tragic things like suicide are on the rise in Gaza because of the trauma and the PTSD that people are facing there. And it's young people who are at the highest risk of this. I would just note that our donors have actually supported a very, very important UNRWA program for the past 6 or 7 years, and that's UNRWA's Community Mental Health Program. This is a program that puts counselors in every school across Gaza. That's 272 schools. So there are counselors in every school across Gaza. Every child at an UNRWA school is getting some form of psychosocial support. So whether that is an art or play or dance therapy session, a group session, or whether that's one-on-one, much more serious counseling for those children who are most affected, every child is getting some form of psychosocial support to help them be able to cope with what they've lived through, to help them deal with their emotions, their feelings, so that they hopefully can have a brighter future. And I've felt very, very honored to be able to participate in some of these community mental health activities when I visited UNRWA schools in Gaza. And it's really tremendous to see the impact that these activities have on the kids there. I mean, you can really see how these counselors are getting through to the kids that they work with. And these counselors care so passionately. They're deeply invested in each and every one of the students that they're serving. And it really shows. You can see the direct, tangible impact that these services are having on these kids and helping them to cope with all that they're facing. So we raise funds at Unruh USA for this program through our Gaza 5K events, which we host all across the country. We recently hosted our 5K in New York City, so I hope some of you all were able to make it, coming up from Jersey or elsewhere. We have 2 more coming up this year, one in Washington, D.C. in September, and one in Houston in November. So if anybody is able to make it, we would love for you to participate. There'll be more information on our website, gaza5k.org. But again, I have to go back to the reality of the situation, and that reality is without increased funding for the agency, community mental health program is yet another program that is at risk of being cut. And I know I'm starting to sound like I'm repeating myself a lot, but all of these very, very critical services are truly at risk with this unprecedented crisis of funding that the agency is facing. Moving along to another slide, I think this is an important point to make. You know, for the first time ever, the US government actually chose to geographically restrict funds to UNRWA. So this means of the $60 million that the US government gave at the beginning of this year, they made the caveat that these funds could only go to the occupied territory, so Gaza and the West Bank, and Jordan. So they effectively excluded Lebanon and Syria from the funding that they provided. And as I said, this is something that has never been done before. Geographically earmarking funds in this way is unprecedented. And certainly could lead to very, very catastrophic results, because if we go ahead and move to the next slide, I do want to talk about the current situation in Yarmouk, which I'm sure many of you are seeing on the news. Before the start of the war in Syria, there were over 500,000 Palestinian refugees living there. Since that time, many have fled. Some have fled to Lebanon, some have fled to Jordan, although both of those countries did actually close their borders to Palestinians years ago at this point. Other Palestinians fled to Turkey and perhaps, you know, onward from there. Many of them are now internally displaced within Syria. And UNRWA is the only agency, the only humanitarian agency that is dedicated to serving this population in Syria. So this, you know, approximately 500,000, probably slightly less now, though it's hard to know with certainty the numbers. It is only UNRWA that they're counting on for the services that they need, whether that's education for their children, healthcare for their families, social services, or primarily emergency support and protection. Like currently 95% of Palestinian refugees in Syria are receiving some form of support from UNRWA. This is something that is totally unprecedented for Palestinians within Syria. Before the war started, Palestinians there enjoyed a certain level of protection and citizenship, and for the most part, weren't heavily reliant on UNRWA services to get by. But all of that changed when the war started, and they are now an incredibly vulnerable population in the country. And as I mentioned, 95% now need UNRWA just to get by. I really do want to turn our attention to Yarmouk, which is truly a humanitarian catastrophe, to say the least. Yarmouk was once a thriving Palestinian refugee camp outside of Damascus, but it's actually been under siege since 2013. And you may have seen most recently, there has been very, very active, violent fighting in Yarmouk. UNRWA is again warning of the catastrophic consequences of this severe escalation of fighting. The current hostilities have actually caused deaths and injuries and have displaced around 5,000 civilians from Yarmouk into the neighboring area of Yalda, where there are already about 3,500 Palestinian refugees. There's also an unconfirmed number of civilians stranded within Yarmouk who are in dire need of a safe passage out of the camp. The families who've managed to take refuge in Yalda have been forced to sleep in the streets or in makeshift shelters. I really can't overstate how catastrophic the humanitarian conditions are right now as we speak. The intense bombing and shelling has reportedly damaged thousands of houses. There's no longer any sort of running water, and there's very little electricity. Yarmouk's last remaining hospital is now no longer functional at all, and there are no doctors remaining or healthcare options for those who are still stranded within Yarmouk. The checkpoint into the area has been closed for passage of civilians or goods in. So again, this is truly a humanitarian catastrophe. And yet the funding to Unruh for emergency services in Syria has been frozen by the United States, which is only further exacerbating the catastrophe that we're currently seeing right now. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. I know a lot of what I've told you is, very, very tragic and can seem very disheartening, but I do want you to know that there are lots of ways for the American community and for you specifically to get involved with UNRWA's work and to help Palestinian refugees. So I really do want to talk through some of those ways that you can do that, and I want you to know that you should feel empowered to do what you can from your end, and we want to help you feel that way. So first and foremost, if we move to the next slide, I think you know what I'm going to say. The most important thing right now is UNRWA needs funds. So UNRWA USA is a charitable nonprofit organization. If you donate, you do receive a tax deduction. We really need people donating as much as possible right now to help us ensure we can continue to keep services running for refugees in need. I would really encourage you to visit our website. Our website is unrwausa.org. If you visit the website, there are lots of opportunities for you to read more about our work, to see the current campaigns that we're running. Our major campaign right now is simply called Fund UNRWA. And this campaign is meant to raise funds to directly address this funding crisis that the agency is currently in the midst of. If you want to take a step beyond just donating, I would encourage you to either, one, become a solidarity sustainer. These are our monthly donors. These are the donors who are giving us the consistent support that we need to ensure that we can consistently keep running programs. If you want to take it one step further, I would encourage you to create your own personal fundraising page. All of this can be done through our website. If you create a fundraising page, this gives you the opportunity to share that page out with your network of friends and family. You can create your own personal story, tell them why it is so important for you to be helping Palestinian refugees through UNRWA at this time. It gives you the opportunity to really connect with people that we might not otherwise be connected to. And it really helps spread the message of the importance of ensuring that Palestinian refugees are not forgotten amidst this administration's, unprecedented policies. Very soon we will be launching our Ramadan campaign, which we will be exclusively raising funds for UNRWA's food assistance program in Gaza. As I mentioned, it is a program that is under direct threat of being cut before the end of Ramadan, and we want to make sure that we can ensure that families in Gaza this Ramadan are able to break their fast. That will be happening soon. In addition to that, we have a series called Iftar for Gaza. Iftar for Gaza is an opportunity for our supporters across the United States to carry out their own iftar dinners, events, whatever it might look like to you and your network, to bring people together, but to give them also an opportunity to make their zakat contribution to help people in Gaza this Ramadan. If they're not Muslim, that's fine too. It's an opportunity for them to do a charitable act in support of refugees in need. Something though I would want to mention is that the Unruh Food Assistance Program is indeed zakat eligible, as it's been certified by the National Zakat Foundation. So we really do need your support there. I, again, encourage you to visit our website. It's unrwausa.org. All the information that you might need will be on there. I think at the end of my presentation, I also have ways you can connect with me, and I really encourage you to do so to keep connected. But if we go to the next slide, another thing, and it kind of ties into what I'm talking about already, is help us connect with other individuals and organizations that we might not already be connected to. During the assault on Gaza in 2014, we had so many mosques and churches and synagogues and other sorts of organizations come together to help us raise really critical funds and raise critical awareness with what is happening. And we might not already be connected with some of the organizations that you're connected to or the social groups that you're connected to, but you can help us grow our supporter base by connecting us with individuals who care about Palestinian refugees and want to make a difference. We move on to the next slide. I discussed this a little bit already, but host or attend an event. We have so many different opportunities for the US community to host their own events in support of UNRWA's work. Iftar for Gaza is our big event series that will be coming up this Ramadan, and we would be delighted for the New Jersey community to really come together to put together an iftar event that won't just be, feeding the New Jersey community, but will help us feed the communities in Gaza as well. So I would love to be able to work with you all on putting something like that together. We also plan on hosting our own UNRWA USA Iftar events. So if you're able to attend, we are looking to have one in New York. We would love to have you there as well. If we move to the next slide, funding right now is supremely important, but I do want to say it's not just about fundraising. It really is also about education and awareness. A lot of the American community is just not keyed into this issue like you and I are. And so it's really important that we are connecting with those to help educate and bring awareness about the situation that Palestinian refugees are facing and about ways that the US community can proactively get involved to help. So I really would encourage all of you to start following UNRWA USA on social media. We have a really big presence on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and even LinkedIn, and we'd really love to stay connected with you so you can help us spread our word even further. We push a lot out through social media, and you can help us push those messages even further to your social media networks. If you want to get even more involved, you can visit our website, and we do have the opportunity for people to join our email list. I would encourage you to do that. We send out all sorts of different emails, some about fundraising, but some are really just about education and outreach. And that's where we can always use more support across the entire United States. We also have a blog on our website, which I think is really cool. It's called Voices of UNRWA. This is a blog series where we showcase and highlight stories of individuals who either once benefited from UNRWA services, attended UNRWA schools, were employed by UNRWA. We give them the opportunity to share their story and explain why supporting UNRWA's work is so important and how it directly impacted their lives and how they know it can directly impact so many others' lives. I would truly encourage you to check out the Voices of UNRWA blog. It's really inspiring, the stories that you read. Many of these individuals are now in the United States doing really incredible things for local communities here. And if you know of anybody who is an Unruh alumni, who might have a story to share, please connect them with us. We want to be showcasing these stories. We want to, dispel misconceptions that people have around who a refugee is. And we want local communities across the United States to see that they have members in their communities who are Palestinian refugees who are making incredible contributions to society. Other things you can do is we now have a monthly Facebook Live event called Let's Talk Unruh. We'd love for you to participate anytime you can. We try to showcase different subject areas and interview different people about the work that UNRWA is doing and about Palestinian refugees. So if you follow us on Facebook, you'll see when we have an upcoming Facebook Live event happening. If we move on to the next slide, I've kind of already addressed this, but please, you can help us advocate so much through social media. The majority of the news that people read these days, they are reading it through social media. So if we're able to get out messages of support for Palestinian refugees and articles that really highlight the importance of supporting refugees, then we're doing our part to help educate the US public, and you can help us do that even more than we can do on our own. Just wrapping things up, we do have a volunteer program as well. If you have, special skill sets or areas of expertise that you think could be, something that you'd want to contribute to our organization, please reach out. We have a section on our website directly for that. And we have an incredible staff member, Lori, who works with our volunteers to provide meaningful opportunities for you to help us out. So I would definitely encourage that as well. And as I already mentioned, we have this UNRWA alumni program, which ties to the Voices of UNRWA, where we really want to connect with individuals who benefited from UNRWA services or attended UNRWA schools or worked for UNRWA. So please share with us if you know of individuals who want to be connected in that capacity. And then just lastly, here's my contact information. I'd love to stay connected with everybody. There's my email address, my Twitter handle. Again, our website is unruhusa.org. Please feel free to peruse the website and get involved in as many ways as you're interested in doing so. And you can help us make a real difference here in the United States for Palestinian refugees in the Middle East. So I really do thank you, and I'm happy to welcome any questions now.
Thank you so much, Abby. I think that was a very, very well put and educational presentation. I want to just echo exactly what Abby said, that in my time in the center, we've seen a lot of people who either graduated from UNRWA schools or worked at UNRWA schools that are, seeking employment here. And it's always a plus if they graduated from an UNRWA school, because that means they achieved, very good education. So thank you guys for all the work that you do. We have about 10 minutes left for questions. I'm going to start off the questions with, so how have you seen the support, or, after the decision? What have you been seeing? Have you been seeing people, more sympathetic? Have donations been coming more in? Like, what's the response been like so far?
Yeah, absolutely. Amongst the U.S. community, we have actually seen an exponential increase in support for the work that UNRWA is doing. Our fundraising here at UNRWA USA has certainly increased. We also had a petition that went out asking people to, basically share with the administration that they want their tax dollars to continue to support Palestinian refugees through these humanitarian services. And we had thousands of people sign on to this. So we're seeing really grassroots level support in a way that we have never seen before. We just need that grassroots level to translate into the administration listening to what people want.
And hopefully that will definitely happen. So we have a few people on the line right now. Does anyone have any questions? You can definitely type it in the chat box. You can raise your hand if you want help unmuting, or you can just unmute and ask your question.
Hi, Rania.
Hi, Anne.
Hi. My question is the money that you fundraise through UNRWA USA. So you channel that directly into the UNRWA fund itself. So it goes through the UN organization, like the UN agency, or how does that work?
Yes, yeah, that's a great question. Yes, it goes directly to UNRWA, so directly through the UN system. So we have a very close cooperation agreement with UNRWA, and everything that we do is in support of their work, and all of the funds that we raise go only to UNRWA.
Okay, so it goes there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to jump in. Again, chat box, raise your hand, whatever you would like. So I guess I'll ask another question in the meantime. So how have you been seeing any support, I guess, from Arab nations or anywhere around the world, kind of like a specific like help or outpour of support since this decision has been made?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a pledging conference in Rome in March. And at that time, various state governments did step up to provide additional funding. The state of Qatar has stepped up. The Royal Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has stepped up some. We've seen countries, Turkey and Japan, who have been long-term supporters of the agency, but they really have increased their level of support, understanding the gravity of this situation. And in terms of like European countries, something that several of the countries have done, it's not necessarily an increase in the funding, but what they've done is they've front-loaded some of their contributions that would have been multi-year contributions. They've given all of those funds up front to ensure that things like UNRWA schools can continue to run throughout the school year. It's not a long-term solution, to say the least. But it does ensure that in the short term, kids can still go to school and people can still attend health clinics as needed.
Thank you for that. I think I got something in the chat. So Musbih is asking, hello everyone, how do we volunteer in the refugee camps and interact with refugees?
Yeah, it's a very good question. If you are interested in somehow volunteering or interning with UNRWA or in the camps, I would encourage you to please email me directly. My email address is right there, abby@unruhusa.org. There aren't a lot of volunteer or intern opportunities, but there are some, particularly if you have very specific skill sets that the agency is in need of. So, you know, if you could just in your email explain if you do have levels of expertise that you think the agency could really benefit from. Obviously, there are limitations geographically where we can have interns and volunteers. Gaza is not an option because of the blockade. Syria, of course, is not an option because of the security issues. But certainly email me, and you know, if it's possible, then I would absolutely love to connect you with the appropriate UNRWA staff.
Thank you very much. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to ask it now. So again, either via the chat box or you can unmute yourself. I think if you're calling via phone, you can press *6 to unmute. And I think Nisreen is in the process of typing her question. So until Nisreen answers his question, I'll give another example of something that we worked with UNRWA a couple years ago with, and it would be great if we can see other organizations and other places doing it as well. We hosted a photo exhibit where we auctioned off the pictures, you know, that are part of the photo exhibit. It was a very educational event, and it was also a very beneficial event in terms of fundraising. So I highly recommend that if anyone can host something like that, they look into doing that as well. So Nisreen's question is, how will the SG's new reform agenda affect UNRWA's funding crisis?
Yeah, the short answer is we don't know yet. The Secretary General has been very, very vocal in his support of UNRWA, and very vocal in that state governments really do need to step up to address this funding crisis. Something that is interesting about UNRWA is that it is entirely voluntarily funded, primarily by state governments, but no government is mandated to support UNRWA's work. It's all done on a voluntary basis. So, you know, generally speaking, it's challenging to enforce any sort of like funding mandate. But as I said, the Secretary General has been very vocal in his support for UNRWA and very vocal that the services that UNRWA provides must continue. So it's yet to be seen in terms of how the reforms could affect, but we know that we have a strong advocate in the Secretary General.
So I think if there are no more questions, going once, going twice, going 3 times. Well, with that, I want to sincerely thank you, Abby, for taking time out of your day to give us this very educational and informative presentation. I want to thank all our attendees for coming on in the middle of the day to attend this webinar. We are, in fact, recording this webinar. It should be up by the end of this week. Please make it a point to share. This is not going to be a one-time thing. We're hoping to continue doing at least once a month a webinar. We're inviting different speakers to come speak about various topics about the Palestinian reality. So if you're interested in staying in touch with the stuff we do at PAC, please make sure to subscribe to our mailing list at www.paccusa.org/subscribe. I'll write it in the chat box, so if anyone wants to write that down or just click on the link to go subscribe. Once again, we send out a newsletter every Wednesday, updating with all our upcoming events, and we have quite a bit of more of exciting, other webinars coming up throughout the summer and throughout the fall. So I want to thank you all again for coming. Thank you, Abby, so much. Thank you, Leila, for helping to coordinate this, and I hope everyone has a fabulous rest of their day.
Thank you, Ronnie. I appreciate it.